This is the first of two videos of the third part of an introduction to Judaism. The first part consists of two videos dealing with the nature of traditional Judaism as a religion. The second part consists of three videos dealing with the essence of Judaism as a religion, faith, or good deeds. And this third part will consist of two videos dealing with the importance of study in the Jewish tradition. Each of the three parts, I'm telling a rabbi-priest joke, and in light of the rabbi-priest joke, I'm teaching about Judaism in a very serious way. So in the first two parts, in light of the rabbi-priest jokes that I told, I drew comparison between Judaism and Christianity. I will not be doing that in this third part. I'll simply be talking about something that I think is very, very unique to Judaism as a religion, the importance of study. But I'll talk about the importance of study in the second video of this third part of an introduction to Judaism. In this first video, prior to telling the rabbi-priest joke, I'll be giving quite a bit of background, as the rabbi-priest joke that I'll be telling relates to the Talmud, and I want to give some background about the Talmud as the foundation of the Jewish rabbinic tradition. So, ready to begin then? The background. 3 points by way of background. The first point concerning the Talmud as the foundation of the Jewish rabbinic tradition. The term Talmud today is used interchangeably with another term, Gemara. Talmud, Gemara, they're used interchangeably today. In the ancient Talmudic period, there was a very important difference between these two terms. They actually represented two different methods of study or learning. So that Gemara was study, learning on the basis of tradition, and Talmud was study, learning on the basis of reasoning, principles of logic. Okay. However, today the terms are used interchangeably. And the terms today refer to the Talmudic literature. Okay, or Talmud, Gemara, both terms are referring to the Talmudic literature. And the Talmudic literature is actually, when we're speaking about the Talmudic literature, we're speaking about, we have two Talmuds, or Gemara, two Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. This is the Talmudic literature, the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud. And both of these Talmuds, both of these literatures are extensive literatures, volumes and volumes of material. Each of the Talmuds is volumes and volumes of material. And this material was produced out of the ancient yeshivot, rabbinical academies, study academies in which the rabbis as teachers, the term rabbi means teacher, and the yeshivot were rabbinical academies in which the rabbis studied together with their students. And out of the yeshivot were produced the Talmudic literatures, so that the Jerusalem Talmud grew out of the yeshivot that existed in the land of Israel in the ancient Talmudic period. Actually, there weren't yeshivot in Jerusalem. The yeshivot were outside of Jerusalem in the land of Israel, but we nevertheless call the Jerusalem Talmud the Jerusalem Talmud, but it was produced out of the yeshivot in the land of Israel in the ancient Talmudic period. The Babylonian Talmud was produced out of the yeshivot that existed in the land of Babylonia. Okay. Now, for a variety of historical reasons that I won't go into, but for a variety of reasons, it's the Babylonian Talmud that is authoritative. And it's the Babylonian Talmud that is the foundation of the Jewish rabbinic tradition. Okay? So that when we speak of the Talmud, we are speaking of the Babylonian Talmud, if we do not specify. And we speak in a general way of the Talmud, we're speaking of the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud that's authoritative. If we speak of the Jerusalem Talmud, then we will specify and specify that we're speaking of the Jerusalem Talmud. But the Talmud in general, the Babylonian Talmud. Okay? So that's point number one. Point number two. that we as traditional Jews live not by the Hebrew Bible as it's written. We live as traditional Jews by the Hebrew Bible as it's understood and interpreted according to the Jewish rabbinic tradition, according to the Jewish tradition, the foundation of the Jewish rabbinic tradition, the foundation of which is the Talmud. Okay, so we live not by the Hebrew Bible as it's written, we live by the Hebrew Bible as it's understood and interpreted according to tradition, the foundation of our tradition being the Talmud. Okay, so let me just give an example. The verse from the Bible, "You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk." Okay? On the basis of that verse, there's a prohibition in the Jewish law and the Jewish tradition, a prohibition of mixing milk and meat, a prohibition of cooking and eating milk and meat together. Okay? Now, that prohibition of the Jewish law, of the Jewish tradition, that's not written at all. Such a prohibition is not written at all in the plain meaning of the Bible. What's written in the verse, it's based, the law, that we are not to mix milk and meat, according to Jewish law, according to Jewish tradition. That law is based on the verse, "You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk." But that isn't what's written in the verse. 2 points regarding the verse. Number one, the word that is translated as milk in Hebrew can also mean fat. In my opinion, in all likelihood, the original meaning of the verse, "You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk," was actually, the original historical meaning was, in all likelihood, "You shall not cook a kid in its mother's fat." Why? Because in the ancient biblical world, and in the Israelite culture, the ancient Israelite culture, the surrounding pagan cultures, animal sacrifice was a central form of ritual worship. And what was sacrificed in the biblical world and the pagan world? What was sacrificed, animal sacrifice is a form of ritual worship. What was sacrificed was the meat and fat of animals. And so in all likelihood, the verse, "You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk," probably was originally, "You shall not cook a kid in its mother's fat," which was probably some kind of an ancient Canaanite or pagan practice that the Bible is reacting to. Okay? But let's leave aside that issue, and we'll accept the traditional Jewish reading of the verse, our traditional reading. "You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk." Point number 2 regarding the verse. In any case, the verse doesn't prohibit the mixing of milk and meat. Because I could, on the basis of the verse, I can take cow's meat, which isn't a kid. The verse says you should not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So I'll take meat from a cow, and I'll roast the cow's meat on an open fire, which according to the Jewish tradition, roasting on an open fire does not constitute cooking. Okay? And then on top of that, I'll take milk from a goat, which isn't the same species of animal as the cow that I'm using for the meat. So there would be no problem whatsoever if we had only the verse alone. There would be no problem mixing milk and meat. I can take, again, cow's meat, roast it on an open fire, take goat's milk, and mix the two. And there would be no problem if we had only the verse alone. "You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk." So the law then, that we are not to mix milk and meat, the prohibition not to mix milk and meat, not to cook and eat milk and meat together in the Jewish tradition, is not found in the plain meaning of the Bible. And actually, most of the material of our tradition, we have 2 kinds of material. We have legal material that we call halakha, and we have non-legal material that we call agadah, moral, spiritual, philosophic teachings. Most of the material of our tradition, okay, is not the plain meaning of the Bible. Most of the material, legal material, non-legal material, moral, spiritual, philosophic teachings, is not the plain meaning of the Bible, or found in the plain meaning of the Bible. It is, and It's what we call midrash, which was the ancient method of study of the Talmudic, the main method of study of the Talmudic rabbis, going back to the Talmud. So midrash was a very unique method of study of the Bible, in which the rabbis, the Talmudic rabbis, understood the Bible not according to its plain, simple meaning. The method of midrash is an elaboration beyond the plain, simple meaning. Okay, so if, again, we take the verse, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. On the basis of that verse, we learn a law that is learned out by midrash. Okay, it's an elaboration. It's not found in the plain meaning of the verse, but that's an elaboration. It's what we call a midrash halacha, that we prohibit the mixing of milk and meat, even though that's not the plain meaning of the biblical text. And so too, there's Midrash Agadah, Midrash Halacha, Midrash Agadah. Most of the teachings of our tradition, both Halacha, law, and Agadah, moral, spiritual, philosophic teachings of our tradition, are not found in the plain meaning of the Bible. They're Midrash Halacha, Midrash Agadah. Okay, elaboration beyond the plain meaning of the Bible. Now, in the case of the verse, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Even though the law prohibiting mixing of milk and meat is not the plain meaning of the biblical text, nevertheless, that's regarded as biblical law, or what we would call from the Torah law. That Torah here is referring to the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books of Moses is a kind of legal constitution of the Jewish people, because the Jewish law is based upon the commandments, mitzvot, of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. So in this case, the verse, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk, is a mitzvah, a commandment. On the basis of that commandment, we learn a law that is regarded as from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses, biblical law, that we are prohibited to mix milk and meat, even though that's not the plain meaning. Okay, and we have other sources of law in the Jewish tradition besides laws from the Torah, from the Bible. We also have laws that are rabbinic enactments, decrees, and we have customs of the Jewish people, in the main 3 sources. So a biblical law, rabbinic law, and customs of the Jewish people. So in the case of the verse, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk, even though it's not the plain meaning of the text, nevertheless, that verse is understood as prohibiting, according to biblical law, a law from the Torah, prohibiting the mixing of milk and meat. Rabbinic law, we separate, according to rabbinic law, rabbinic enactment, we separate dishes and utensils. In order not to violate the biblical law, in order not to mix milk and meat, we separate dishes and utensils. Okay, that's what's called in the ancient Talmudic tradition building a fence around the Torah. It's like a precautionary measure to keep us from violating the Torah, the Bible. We separate dishes and utensils. Custom. How long do we wait between eating milk and meat? If we've eaten meat, how long do we wait before we eat milk products? So that's a matter of custom in the Jewish tradition. And there are various customs among the Jewish people. There are Jews who wait as little as 1 hour between meat and milk. There are Jews who wait up to 6 hours, and all kinds of customs in between. Okay? Now, one other point that's very, very important, and that is, as a result of this, or the implications of this method of study of Midrash, that the Talmudic rabbis were not bound by the plain meaning of biblical texts, and they elaborated in a systematic way beyond the plain meaning. What that means then is that Judaism, the Jewish tradition, is not fundamentalist. We're not bound by the plain meaning of biblical texts. There's one other example in this regard. The verse, let's take the verse, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So suppose that I knock the eye out of some other person, okay? According to the verse, and the plain meaning of the verse, the punishment would be actual bodily punishment, to knock my eye out, remove my eye as a punishment for knocking the eye out of another person, okay? Now, According to tradition, Jewish tradition, again, we don't live by the Bible as it's written, the plain meaning. So Midrash Halacha, elaboration of the Talmudic rabbis, Midrash Halacha, we understand that verse, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, metaphorically, monetary compensation. So that no Jewish court of law today, until this day, no Jewish rabbinic court of law from the Talmudic period until today is permitted as a form of punishment to use actual bodily punishment. In this case, if I've knocked the eye out of another person, no Jewish court will be permitted to remove my eye as a punishment. Rather, I'll be obligated in monetary compensation, paying for the damage that I caused to this person in knocking out their eye, the medical expenses, embarrassment that I caused to the person in knocking out their eye, loss of work, all kinds of monetary payments that I'll be obligated to make, but under no circumstances will a Jewish court be permitted to use actual bodily punishment on the basis of the verse. Okay? So that the second point then is that we live as traditional Jews, not by the Bible as it's written. We live by the Bible as it's understood and interpreted according to the Jewish tradition, and the foundation of the Jewish tradition is the Talmud. And what that means then is that the Jewish tradition, we are not fundamentalists. We are not bound by a fundamentalist, a literal understanding of the Bible. We're not bound by what's written in the Bible. We live according to tradition. The Bible as it's understood according to tradition, the foundation of our tradition, the foundation of which is the Talmud. Okay, that's point number 2. Point number 3. There are 2 things that stand out as characteristic of the Talmud as literature. The first thing that stands out is argument and debate. Argument and debate was the method of study in the ancient yeshivot, rabbinical academies, in which the rabbis studied together with their students. So, argument, debate. Virtually every issue in the Jewish tradition, whether a legal issue, matter of halacha, law, or a non-legal issue, agadah, moral, spiritual, philosophic teachings, virtually every issue in the Jewish tradition is a matter of argument and debate. And as a result of this method of study, what you have flowing from argument and debate is, in modern jargon, pluralism. A plurality, a wide variety of viewpoints and positions regarding virtually every issue. Indeed, there's a joke, a famous joke, that illustrates the pluralistic nature of the Jewish tradition on the basis of the Talmud. And the joke is that you have any 2 Jews together, you have at least 3 different opinions. That very much characterizes the Talmud and the Jewish tradition based on the Talmud. When we study texts in the Jewish tradition, biblical texts, rabbinic texts, when we study texts, we study with a wealth of commentaries surrounding the text. And that means regarding any particular word, phrase, any particular passage, biblical literature, rabbinic literature, any particular word, phrase, passage, a variety of viewpoints and interpretations and understandings and argument and debate. Okay? And one other thing regarding argument and debate is that argument and debate as a method of study was borrowed by the Talmudic rabbis from the surrounding Greek culture. Remember that in the early Talmudic period, the Talmudic rabbis were living in a Hellenistic world in which the Greek culture had spread throughout the Near East. And argument, debate as a method of study was really, this was the method of the great Greek philosopher Socrates. We call the method today the Socratic method. That this was borrowed by the Talmudic rabbis, incorporated into Judaism, into the yeshivot as the method of study. Okay. The second thing that characterizes Talmudic study and really stands out as characterizing the Talmud as literature, is a rigorous logic that's based on principles of logic that were also borrowed from the surrounding Greek culture. Principles of logic that were a part of systematic philosophy that emerged in ancient Greece. And the rabbis incorporated not only argument debate as a method of study, they incorporated principles of logic from the Greek culture, and the Talmud to a large extent can be defined as the application of principles of logic to the study of our sacred literature, the Bible. And so that there is a rigorous logic that we call Talmudic logic. It's a rigorous logic that's characteristic of the Talmud. Just one last thing in this regard. At the same time that there's this rigorous theoretical study, rigorous logic, Talmudic logic, there's also a very pragmatic orientation that's characteristic of the orthoprax nature of Judaism. Orthoprax, correct deeds, pragmatic. And there's a very, at one and the same time, a rigorous logic and a very pragmatic orientation that characterizes the Talmud. So that's by way of background. Now to the rabbi-priest joke. Okay, so a rabbi and a priest, they're really good friends. And they get together every so often and they talk. And so one day they've gotten together and they're talking, and the priest says, "You know what, Rabbi?" He says, "You know, I've always had it in the back of my mind that I'd like to at least study a little bit of Talmud to get a taste of what it's about. I've heard so much about it. Just, you know, how about you teaching me a little bit of Talmud?" And the rabbi says, "No way, forget about it." He says, "Forget about it." He says, "You don't have the mind to study Talmud. It requires a Jewish mind. You don't have a Jewish mind. Forget about studying Talmud." And the priest says, "Well, how can you say such a thing?" He says, "How can you jump to a conclusion that I don't have the mind to study Talmud? You haven't even tested me or anything, and at least test me out." And the rabbi says, "Okay, you want me to test you?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "Okay, one question." Okay, so the priest says, "Go ahead." So the rabbi says, "Here's the question. Okay, two people go up on a rooftop. They go down the chimney one after the other. The first one comes out, face is filled with soot, completely dirty. The second one comes down the chimney, his face is completely clean. Which one washes himself?" the rabbi asked the priest. So the priest thinks to himself, "Well, this is really obvious." He suspects maybe there's some kind of a trick question here, but he can't think of what it could be. So he says, "Okay," he says to the priest, "seems to me really obvious. The one with the dirty face washes his face, and the one with the clean face doesn't wash his face. So the one with the clean face doesn't wash his face." So the rabbi says, "You see, you don't have the mind to study Talmud. That's completely wrong." He says, "Look," the rabbi explains, "the first one comes down with a dirty face, okay, and he looks at his friend who comes down after him with the clean face, and so he thinks he also has a clean face, so he doesn't go to wash his face. The one who comes down after with the clean face sees his friend who has a dirty face. He thinks that his face is dirty, so he's the one who goes and washes his face." So the priest says, "Oh my God," he says, "that's okay. I had no idea that this is, you know, what Talmud is about at all. Give me another chance. Give me another shot." And the rabbi says, "Look, give up. It's a lost cause. You don't have the mind to study Talmud. Take my word for it. You don't have the mind to study Talmud. You don't have a Jewish mind." And the priest says, "Give me one more chance, Rabbi." So the rabbi says, "Okay." He says, "Another question." The priest says, "Go ahead." So the rabbi says, "Okay, here's the question. Two men go up on a rooftop. They go down the chimney one after the other. The first one comes out. His face is completely filled with soot, completely dirty. And the one who follows him down comes down. His face is completely clean. Which one washes himself?" He asks the priest. The priest, "Oh my God, this is the same question," he says to himself. "What?" So he says, "Okay." But he says to the rabbi, "The same question. So just like you said, the one with the clean face is the one who will actually wash his face, because he sees his friend who has a dirty face. He thinks his face is dirty. So the one with the clean face he'll go and wash his face." So the rabbi says, "Just like I said, you don't have the mind to study Talmud. That's completely wrong." He says, because you see, when the one with the clean face comes down after, he sees his friend who has the dirty face. He thinks his face is dirty, and the one with the clean face then goes to wash his face. The friend comes with him, and when they go to, and there's a mirror. So when they look in the mirror, the one with the dirty face sees he's got a dirty face. He washes his face. The one with the clean face sees in the mirror he's got a clean face. He doesn't wash his face. So the priest says, wait a minute, that's completely unfair. He says, you didn't say anything, Rabbi, about a mirror. So the rabbi says, okay, that's just what I said. You don't have the mind to study Talmud. Talmud, you have to think about all the logical possibilities. Everything that's possible, you have to think about. And so the priest says, okay, give me one last chance, Rabbi, one last chance. And he says, look, it's a lost cause. Give up already. No, one last chance. He says, okay, this is it. This is your very last chance. He says, okay, last chance. So he says, okay, here's one more question. The priest says, go ahead. So he says, okay, two men, the rabbi says, go up on a rooftop. They go down the chimney. First one comes down, his face is completely filled with soot, completely dirty. The second one comes down with a completely clean face. Which one washes his face? The rabbi asked the priest. So the priest is, okay, look, he says, if there's a mirror, then the one with the clean face won't wash his face. The one with the dirty face will wash his face if there's a mirror. And he says, if there's not a mirror, it's the one with the dirty face will wash his face, because he'll see his friend who has a clean face and think his face is also clean. So the rabbi says, again, just like I said, you don't have the mind to study Talmud. You don't have a Jewish mind. He says, this question is a completely stupid question. How can it possibly be that both of them come down the chimney that's filled with soot, and the second one comes down with a clean face? How can such a thing possibly be? So that's the joke. And again, at the end of the joke there's this kind of pragmatic orientation that the whole question is a stupid question. Okay, but you see, the joke, the joke exemplifies the kind of logic, rigorous logic of Talmudic study. So that's the joke, and I'll finish here then in this video, and then in the next video, as a continuation, in light of this joke, I'll then talk about the importance of study in the Jewish tradition.